Good afternoon. I'm Pastor Bob Uzzle from the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church, Corsicana, Texas. Hope everybody is having an awesome day of Pentecost. Today is May 31st, 2020. It marks the 145th anniversary of a very fascinating man, the subject of my doctoral dissertation at Baylor, which I got my doctorate in 1995, and after 11 years of trying, I finally found a publisher in 2006. And the name of my published dissertation is Eliphas, Levi, and the Kabbalah, the Masonic and French connection of the American mystery tradition. I have been for since 1973, when I first was made a Mason, I became interested in a man named Albert Pike, who was a very controversial figure. His main claim to fame is his leadership of the Scottish Rite and his voluminous Masonic writings, including a celebrated book, Morals and Dogma. And for a number of years, I had a correspondence with the late Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Newton Brown, who lived in El Paso. I did meet him on a couple of occasions, and I did correspond with him, talk with him quite a bit. Colonel Brown, who passed away in 1998 at the age of 99, so he lived a very long life, was the first one who told me about Eliphas Levi, because he had been a principal source of Morals and Dogma. And I began to look further into the man. These two men were definitely contemporaries, born just a couple of months apart. Pike was born on December 29th, 1809. Levi was born February 8th, 1810. There's no evidence they ever met in person. Levi never came to America. Pike never visited France. Eliphas Levi's real name was Alphonse Louis Constant. He was born in Paris on February the 8th, 1810. He was raised, like most Frenchmen of that day, as a Roman Catholic. And he took a great deal of interest in the church. He attended Catholic schools. He was quite brilliant, to say the least. He was the son of a poor shoemaker named Jean-Joseph Constant, his wife Jean Agnes Constant. It was when he was 3 days old he was baptized into the Catholic Church. And in an autobiographical essay, he wrote about his experience of his first communion. Through the mysteries of Catholicism, I glimpsed the infinite. My heart became filled with passion for a God who sacrifices himself for his creatures and transforms himself into bread to nourish them. The gentle image of the immolated lamb brought tears to my eyes. My heart throbbed at the tender name of Mary. As a child, he was given much more to meditation than to action. And early in life, he developed a talent for drawing and painting. He was described as a clever lad, exhibited an aptitude for picking up stray bits of knowledge. He was a very good artist and a very good writer. He was, in many ways, a Renaissance man of his time. And there's no question that the Catholic Church had a lifelong influence on him. But that doesn't mean he accepted everything the church then taught, hook, line, and sinker. He was influenced by Abbé Frere Colonna. My French pronunciations are not the best. He described him as the most intelligent and sincerely pious priest I've ever known. This priest predicted a final golden age of mankind in the shade of the apple trees of a new Eden. A great deal of idealism was influential on him that would characterize the 19th century. By the way, he lived from 1810 to 1875, so you might refer to that as the heart years of the 19th century. And much of the major goings on, he was very well aware of it and part of some of it. And in many ways, he was influenced to the utopian thought. Abbé Colonna was censured, however, by the conservative church hierarchy. And so Levi became very disillusioned with the idea of Roman Catholicism as a great revolutionary force. As I mentioned, his name was Alphonse Louis Constant, but he changed his name to a Hebrew name, Eliphas Levi Zahed, which reportedly is the Hebrew equivalent to his French name. He rarely used the Zahed, the last name, and in most sources he's identified strictly as Eliphas Levi. In my book, I identify him as that, even though it was a number of years into adulthood that he began to use that name. One of his biographers wrote that his Catholicism was too deeply ingrained for him ever to abandon it, but he never lost his dislike for the authoritarian side of the church. He studied for a while at St. Sulpice Seminary, preparing to become a priest. He demonstrated his great scholastic ability, including proficiency in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, as most of us theological students have endured down through the years. I had 3 years of Latin in high school, and later I studied Greek and Hebrew at Baylor, so I understand a little bit about the importance of those languages. But he had problems with the theological instruction. At St. Sulpice, he talked about the chief occupation of students and teachers to be slow and painful learning of ignorance. The main qualities required for success was sufficient memory to retain the old arguments of the scholastics, a little old-fashioned subtlety in making them over again in the Gallican mode, and a tongue capable of repeating and twisting reason to conform to them. From what I gather, academic freedom was largely non-existent there. He declared, "My soul, by virtue of its love alone, sought to raise itself to the divine unity, to the great religion of the future, which will unite all beings in a single being, all sciences in a single idea, all hearts in a single love. In short, to the pantheism that men of bad faith would have us avoid as a monstrous error, and that is in reality the last word of the sublime doctrine of Christ and his apostles." And for a long time he wrestled with the problem of evil. He finally concluded the dogma of hell could no longer stand against my ardent love of God and humanity. It was on the 19th of December, the year 1835, when he was 25 years old, that Alphonse Louis Constant was ordained a deacon, at which time he took a vow of celibacy. And he taught for a while at Petit Séminaire de Paris. And about the same time, he was sent to preach in a number of rural parishes, where he preached with great eloquence. But it's generally believed the doctrines he preached was not necessarily in line with Catholic orthodoxy. And then in May of 1836, a big day was supposed to arrive. He was going to be ordained to a priesthood. But it didn't happen. He concluded I could not take my vows before the altar of a cold, egotistical cult without remorse. A number of factors entered into this, and they were not strictly intellectual. As I've stated before, I have great respect for the Catholic Church. I've been to Mass many times over the years. Some things I like about it, some things I don't. Like Dr. Harvey Cox, I've often seen myself as close to, but outside of the church. I treasure the friendship of many priests, but there's problems there. And in recent years, there's been so much bad publicity regarding abuse by priests. I said it before and I'll say it again. If celibacy was supposed to work as well, if it worked as well as it's supposed to work, they wouldn't have that problem. And Levi was an honest man. And his break was precipitated by an assignment to prepare a class of young girls for their first communion. He recalled, I felt as if I were surrounded by my family, and I was not wrong. They listened to me, they loved me, they respected me as a father. That's nice. He supervised the catechism class for a period of 2 years. The young lady, Adele Allenbach, was one of his catechumens. She was the daughter of a poor woman who had been turned away by a number of priests. They developed a close relationship. She called him my little father. He called her my little girl. On the day of her first communion, he wept as he prayed to God on her behalf. He saw her every day and had no fears of becoming too attached to her. Until the day came, he realized he couldn't do without her. The relationship developed. He recognized it could create a barrier to ordination as a priest. It's good that he found this out before he took the plunge. And so he backed off. He left the seminary. He experienced many crises. His mother committed suicide, and some believe that depression over her son's lost vocation contributed to this. For the time being, he no longer saw Adele Allenbach. I don't know the exact nature of the relationship through the years. I'm online. Yes. Yes. I'm back. Any of you married men out there, you know what it is to do honeydew task. Okay, I do not know the extent of the contact that Eliphas Levi had with Adele Allenbach over the years, but apparently they had some contact. It's reported that in 1875, by then bent with age, Adele moved among the mourners at Eliphas Levi's funeral. But he lived in the poor sections of Paris, where he found earning a living to be very difficult. For a year he taught at a boarding school near Paris, but he did not get along well with the masters at the school. Thus it turned out to be a very unhappy year. If you look back over your life, you can find some years that have been better than others, and all of us have our negative years. That was one of his. By 1839, he established a friendship with Alphonse Ascaros, author of a book called The Magician. Now, Ascaros was described as through him he met a socialist prophet named Ganot, who claimed to be a reincarnation of King Louis the 17th, who had come back to Earth for the fulfillment of work of regeneration. Is that weird? You're going to hear a lot of weird stuff today. They came to scoff and then became disciples. Ganot's combination of socialism and Illuminism influenced Levi's book, La Bible de la Liberté, the Bible of Liberty. As I said, Levi's Catholicism was too ingrained for him to totally abandon it, and he never did. But he was dissatisfied with the church's authoritarian side. So what he did, he ended up trying to reconcile with the church. He went to the Benedictine Abbey at Salamis. There he spent much time in the library studying the Gnostics, the Church Fathers, and Christian mystics. He came under the influence of the 17th century mystic and quietist Madame Guyon. He found her doctrine of universalism exhilarating, developed a vision of a utopian future for a man, with the Virgin Mary as a bridge between the ministry of Jesus and the reign of the Holy Spirit, and a final experience of divine unity through love. And while he was there, his first book was published, La Rosière de Mai. He went to work at the Collège des Jules, first as a tutor of backward students, later as a playground supervisor. Unfortunately, this set the stage for another confrontation with the church. I mentioned a while ago the publication of La Bible de la Liberté, 1841. Now, in America today, we're used to freedom of press. I thank God for the First Amendment. I thank God for freedoms we have. Every country of the world doesn't have that. Historically, a lot of places didn't. France in the 19th century did not. In this book, Levi expressed a mystical, transcendental overview of man's historical struggles, spiritual growths, pointing out the relationship between the two. He presented his visions of God's liberty with charity and love as the breath of life, and governments as servants of the people. Now, they didn't have his superiors at the college didn't have a publish or perish mentality. They were very displeased with his plans for publication, even offered to bribe him to withhold publication. He responded that he was happy he was finally doing something, anything at all, that merited the attention of the church and the offer of financial assistance, which he had long been denied. But he had to stand by his principles. It was on the 13th of February, 1841, the book appeared. Within an hour of its coming off the press, the Paris police had confiscated it, charged both the author and publisher with impiety and advocacy of insurrection. At the subsequent trial, Levi sought to define his position before the jury, to let him know where he stood. I consider exploitation to be a kind of murder, as wrong as any thievery. My only crime is this: I have a deep love for all mankind. Unfortunately, the jury was not favorably impressed. They found him guilty, fining him $300, sentencing him to 8 months in prison. By this time, he was well known, especially in leftist circles, and his trial provoked a great deal of debate. Most socialist writers supported him, though some rejected the Christian context of his ideas. During his incarceration at prison of Saint Pelagie in Paris. He read widely and did a great deal of writing. Eventually, his ideas came to the attention of the Franco-Peruvian socialist and feminist Flora Tristan, who arranged for him to have better food and more comfortable cell. I'm sure he appreciated that. That was a beginning of a close relationship, which culminated in Levy's editing of Tristan's posthumously published book, L'Emancipation of the Woman, La Emancipation de la Femme, I believe that's the pronunciation, close to it, the Emancipation of the Woman. Levi was released from prison in April of 1842, and he got a job painting murals at Choisy-le-Roi. He also began work on a book entitled La Mère de Dieu, the Mother of God. And he sought voluntary self-exile from the political controversies of the capital. He got some support for the church for a while. And he moved to Evreux, where Monsignor Olivier, Bishop of Evreux, became his most intelligent and sympathetic ecclesiastical protector. And he was able to write and get a few articles published. But he could not avoid scandal. He soon found himself unemployed. However, Monsignor Olivier privately provided for his quarters and his subsistence. He even offered him a parish in his diocese on the condition that he take the final vows and become a priest. But Levi was not willing or not ready to make a commitment like that. This book about the Mother of God came out in February of 1844. He presented the Blessed Virgin Mary, the fullest representation of women's purity and holy life. He saw the orgy of strife, faction, greed, war, and inhumanity be resolved through the love of Mary as society exchanged the old Adam for the new Christ. He envisioned a new world order. Oh, that's a controversial term. Arising from the social catharsis of the destructive years, which leveled old values and opened the way for the Holy Spirit, which he saw as feminine. And by the way, he's not the first person in history to come up with that idea. You can Google the term, feminine Holy Spirit, and you find the idea among some of the church fathers. And so these ideas go way back. According to one of his biographers, just as Constance's passion is unquestionably real, so his insights are profound. And Mary and Eve reveal themselves everywhere in human destiny. If C.G. Jung's primal archetypes of human experience do in fact exist, Constance is struggling madly with them in his book. Carl Gustav Jung, my favorite psychologist, who, by the way, was born in 1875, a few months after the death of Eliphas Levi. Carl Jung talked about much of our mental life operating not on the conscious level, but on the unconscious level. He theorized there was not only an individual unconscious, but also a collective unconscious in which the entire human race has a share. He called the elements of the collective unconscious the archetypes. And Levi recalled a prophetic vision he experienced on Easter Eve 1841, which he was convinced that the anarchy, strife, and babble of conflicted voices that characterized his own time was a prelude to the transfiguration of human society. In this dreamlike state, he saw the apocalyptic downfall of the old order, the death of Satan, and the dawning of a new day. In his vision, a young girl was his guide. Uh, Carl Jung would call the young girl the anima. In Jungian analytical psychology, the anima is the feminine image in the masculine psyche, while the animus is the masculine image in the feminine psyche. In The Mother of God, Levi wrote, I found nothing vague or uncertain in the dream of life. God's mind came to the aid of my own, explained to me every image and dissipated every shadow. He spoke of a magnificent synthesis which joins all souls in a single soul, all bodies in a single body through communion, which creates a new world. And he was involved and had some association with some other writers and thinkers of his day. And then in 1843, he published Le Testament de la Liberté, the Covenant of Liberty. During the fall of 1844, he joyfully accepted the invitation of his benefactress, Madame Legrand, to come and live in her house to serve as a tutor for her children. And a month later, he renounced his holy orders. He remained there about a year, then returned to Paris for the publication of the pacifist manifesto La Fête du, or Le Triomphe of La Paix Religieuse. This work was published anonymously, and it's been said he did make some money off his writings. I'm not going to say he invested it very wisely. He spent a lot of it on entertaining friends at lavish champagne parties. In attendance were both old and new friends. And in 1846, he published two political pamphlets, Le Chagrin du Poland and La Voix de la Famine. The latter publication was seized and condemned, and he was charged with disturbing public order by provoking and inciting hatred between the several classes of society, inciting the people of hatred of His Majesty's government. He went on trial on the 3rd of April, 1847. He told the court, you speak of the Abbey Constant. The Abbey Constant no longer exists. The Abbey Constant is dead. You see before you a layman, Alphonse Constant, a designer, painter, man of letters, a poor man, a friend of the poor. The jury fined him 1,000 francs and sentenced him to a year in prison. In August 1847, he was released as a result of a special appeal by Naomi Cadillon, a young lady whom he had married, notwithstanding his previous vows of celibacy. Again, with no freedom of the press, writers definitely took risk in what they wrote. According to one report, Levi had a number of liaisons with female students over the years. He wasn't perfect. No man is. In the mid-1840s, he became romantically involved with a lady named Eugenia, a teacher in a private school for girls at Choisy-le-Roi. One of his teacher's favorite students had been the 17-year-old Naomi Cadillon. Frequently, both of these ladies would accompany him on his Sunday excursions. Naomi had apparently liked Levi and soon had exchanged letters with her teacher's friend. The following summer, Naomi packed all her belongings and traveled to Paris. She presented herself at Levi's apartment, and apparently Levi did not ask her to leave. When her father learned about the living arrangements, he threatened to charge Levi with contributing to the delinquency of a minor unless the couple became legally married. They agreed to his demands, and on the 13th of July, 1846, the ceremony took place. And it was on the 29th of September of 1846 that Naomi gave birth to Levi's daughter Marie. Or rather, I'm sorry, that Eugenie gave birth to his son. And then, about 6 months later, or sometime later, in 1847, Naomi gave birth to his daughter. Levi and Naomi lived a hand-to-mouth existence in the bohemian and radical circles of Paris during the 2 years leading up to the Revolution of 1848. After the fall of the July monarchy, they began to drift further and further apart. Eventually, they became totally estranged. In 1853, she requested a legal separation, and this was granted. In 1854, sadly, their 7-year-old daughter died. In 1865, the marriage was annulled on grounds that Levi's early ecclesiastical position made the marriage contract void. He was never able to rid himself of her memory. And as far as the son goes, we don't know much about him. But at some point, someone contacted him in his adult years, and he owned copies of his father's books, and he seemed to have a great deal of admiration for his absent father. We don't know if they had private meetings over the years or what the relationship was, but his son seemed to respect the work that he did. And he wrote a number of books. 1846, a book on the last incarnation, gospel legends of the 19th century. And the work reflected Levi's religious views, which were no doubt greatly influenced by the political conflict of the time. And he refers to the widow's son as the brother of Christ. He spoke about liberty, equality, and fraternity. And Jesus is depicted as working with an axe, charging people to intelligent workmen. And another place, Jesus is seen as working wisdom in the house of the insane and telling the keepers of the insane his madness is only the love of justice carried to an extreme. And more he is tormented, the more dangerous, incurable will his malady be. And the book's utopian spirit is reflected in the end, where Levi revealed a vision of fields already green with first fraternal crops. He sounds the mysterious prelude of the chant of union. Very interesting writer, and he's not even changed his name yet. The crisis years at St. Sulpice turned a young aspirant to the Catholic priesthood into a man of action, a mystic, and a herald of the new age that would dawn as soon as men freed themselves from the chains of the old. The crisis of the Revolution turned a man of action into a solitary magus, sage, and teacher. It's been said the Revolution of 1848 burned out his radical zeal and gave birth to the magician. And but the writings, his later writings can be seen as extension of his early writings. His occultism does not represent a complete break with previous experiences and beliefs. It's simply a new codification of them. And he wrote so much and did so much. There's, at one point, he met Honi Wronski, a Polish mathematician and theosophist who became his mentor. He described Wronski as learned to the point of becoming unintelligible for everyone else and sometimes for himself. And it was Wronski who introduced Levi to Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, and of the traditions of magic. The two men shared concerns about messianism, the dawning of a new age, and the apotheosis, I think's pronunciation, of human intelligence. And by 1853, the transition was complete. He was 43 years old then. Alphonse Louis Constant became Eliphas Levi Zayat. He wrote his masterpiece, published 1856, Dogma and Ritual, Dogma et Rituel de la Haute Magie, the Dogma and Ritual of the High Magic. And 4 years later, Histoire de la Magie, History of Magic. His third occult work was La Clef des Grands Mysteries, the Key of the Mysteries. These three works served as the foundation of all his later writings. On the 14th of March, 1861, he was initiated into Freemasonry by a friend named Jean-Marie Lazare Cobbett, who was serving as worshipful master of Les Loges de la Rose du Parfait Silence, the lodge of the Lodge of the Rose of Perfect Silence. Then on the 21st of August, 1861, he received the degree of Master Mason. He became a Freemason with firm conviction that Masonic symbolism was rooted in Kabbalah. As it turned out, his association with the Masons of France was not a happy one. At the time, the Grand Orient of France was moving in the direction of secularism and anti-clericalism, which he found quite distasteful. He was quite certain that the real meaning of the complicated and bizarre Masonic symbolism had been lost to many Masons. 1 month after his raising, he was invited to make an address to the lodge. He told them he had come among them to teach them so they might recover the lost tradition of Freemasonry, the exact knowledge of its signs and symbols. He said that at a later time he hoped to teach them why the Masonic order came into existence in the first place. He was a brilliant man, had a lot of things he could teach, but the people didn't want to learn. He said, I ceased being a Freemason at once because the Freemasons excommunicated by the Pope did not believe in tolerating Catholicism. I thus separated from them to protect my freedom of conscience, to avoid their reprisals, perhaps excusable if not legitimate, but certainly inconsequential, because the essence of Freemasonry is the tolerance of all beliefs. Interpretations of Masonic philosophy and symbolism is found throughout his writings. It was very obvious that the Masons of France did not desire to receive more light from the teachings of Eliphas Levi. He also became an authority on the symbolism of the Rosicrucians. He may have joined one of the Rosicrucian groups emerging in France at the time. And He saw the rose as a type of beauty, life, love, and pleasure, a mystical expression of the secret thought of all protests manifested at the Renaissance. He understood the union of the rose and the cross as a problem for high initiation. There's several different Rosicrucian groups today, and not all of them see eye to eye on everything, but in one way or another, Levi seems to have left his impact upon them. Initiation, adeptship, these things are quite prominent in Levi's writings. He described ancient initiatory societies as seminaries for priests and kings. He believed medieval secret societies perpetuated the initiatory system of the Egyptian mysteries. And he saw initiation as the essential law of religious life. He saw the death of Jesus representing the highest and most sublime of the arcana, the last word of all initiations. He declared Christ died as a young man on a cross. All those whom he has initiated have become martyrs. He interpreted the visit of the wise men from the east to the cradle of Jesus, guided by the Star of Solomon, as symbolic of Jesus' mission to consecrate anew the fires of Zoroaster, to renovate the symbolic treasures of Hiram, and to bind up the mutilated form of Osiris. In the narrative of Jesus' nativity, he saw the Magi as honoring the infancy of Christian initiation. And the Magi's return home by another road in order to avoid the wicked schemes of Herod. He saw symbolized the road of occultism, which is ignored by the world, but well known to adepts, whom he regarded as the Magi of the day. Now, using the word occultism, let me make a very important point. Occultism in the 19th century did not have the sinister meaning it has today. One organization that's been greatly influenced by Levi is the Theosophical Society. In one of their pamphlets, they pointed about their uneasy relationship with occultism because an occult section of a bookstore, you're going to find a wide variety of topics, some that are innocent, some that are questionable, and some downright evil. And with this definition, the organization wants no part, pointing out the first step towards spiritual progress is a clean life. And black magic and devil worship and this type of thing were totally far removed from Eliphas Levi. And he said the mysteries were not fully comprehended by the average initiate in a Masonic or Rosicrucian lodge. And I fully agree with him on that. In later chapters, we look at these things, these influences. The Levi's last years. He spent the last 20 years engaged in writing and in giving private instruction to students who visited his apartment in Paris. One of them was Pascal Beverly Randolph, founder of Fraternitas Rosicruci. And interestingly enough, this man from the United States, who most scholars now believe was of mixed race, possibly including some African American ancestry, talked to him about the meaning of the symbolism, especially the number 5. And number 5 have always been fatal to you. Look back and recollect. Your mortal life started in 1815. Your memory failing to recollect beyond that point. 1815, he was 5 years old. 1825, he entered the seminary. 1835, you left the seminary, entered the freedom of consciousness. 1845, you published The Mother of God, your first essay on religion. You broke your connection with the church. 1855, you were a free man being deserted by a woman who had absorbed you and forced you to submit to the law of binary. And you went to England. You were there to dive in the masculine and active principles. It was there you saw Apollonius, sad, tired, and suffering like yourself, because Apollonius, you saw yourself, a phantom that came out of yourself, again becoming part of you and still with you. You will see him again in 1865, but then beautiful, radiant, and triumphant. The natural end of your life is marked as 1875, as is mine, accidents aside. And Levi did pass away in 1875. As far as Randolph goes, he made sure his prophecy was fulfilled by means of suicide. And most of Levi's last 20 years were spent in Paris. He visited London in 1854 and again in 1861. He also visited Germany during the summer of 1871. This latter visit occurred at the time of the Franco-Prussian War. And he spent 2 months at the home of Gustave and Marie Gebhardt. Mrs. Gebhardt observed there seemed to be no book on the subject of mysticism he had not read, that he had great memory and a way of words. She declared, I look upon Eliphas Levi as one of the truest friends I ever had, for he taught me the highest truth, which it is in power of man or woman to grasp. He changed apartments only 3 times between 1854 and 1875. He got some royalties from his books and money from private lessons he gave to students. He was a very successful teacher, more interested in opening the minds of students than indoctrinating them. And one of his students described him vested invariably when at home in a long robe with his long white beard and bald head. He recalls somewhat confusedly the astrologers of the Middle Ages. And some devoted disciples remained close to him during his latter years. He reflected a great deal of inner peace and a positive attitude toward life and death. He said, everyone is good to me. Everyone breathes an atmosphere of deep peace. The earth would be an Eden for me if my brothers were not suffering. Children smile and approach me when I rest in parks and gardens. I have never knowingly or willingly harmed anyone. I still love the things I once loved: knowledge, poetry, religion, liberty, the sun, the world's greenness. I feel loved by those things in return. Let the dead leaves fall. Spring is immortal in her constant return. As the year of 1875 wore on, his physical condition steadily became worse. And he experienced repeated attacks of dropsy and gangrene. And but he experienced his last agonizing days with much courage. His mental faculties were preserved to the end. Near his bed was a beautiful image of Jesus, at which he often looked. Pointing to this image, he said to a visitor, he told me that he would send the Consoler, the Spirit, and I am waiting for the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. In May of 1875, he made out his last will and testament. It was on the 29th of May He was visited by one of his students, Madame Gilbert, who could sense the end was near, and she decided to summon a priest. And after refusal at one church, she went to a Jesuit chapel in the Rue des Sèvres and talked with a Father Lejeune, who agreed to visit Levi. He came the next day, but for some reason was unable to gain entry. He returned on the 31st of May, 1875. He had a long talk with Levi and probably granted absolution. At 2 p.m. that day, Eliphas Levi died, and one of his friends arranged for him to be photographed on his deathbed. His funeral was held on the 2nd of June at the Church of Saint Francois Xavier on the Boulevard of the Invalids. He was buried at the cemetery of Ivry. A small group of devotees gathered around his grave. His friend André Diderot delivered the eulogy, praising him for his courage and renouncing the priesthood, his personal charity, his efforts to unite science and religion, great writings he had left. His closing words were, "Farewell, Constant, honest and loyal soul you have, who never knew charity and yet practiced it with dignity. Rest in peace, and may the sincere grief of your friends be proof of the void which you have left among them." And A.E. Waite, who edited and translated a number of Levi's writings, was also one of his major critics. But he gave the following tribute to the French magus. Eliphas Levi has originated a new departure in Kabbalistic exegesis. His interpretations have fused a new life into old symbolism. We need have no hesitation in proclaiming him an initiate of the first order and the prince of the French adepts. The noble and generous spirit of Eliphas Levi has passed behind the veil, has doubtless achieved the immortality he aspired to, and the absolute which he sought in life. In 1994-95, I gave much attention to research that produced my doctoral dissertation that eventually became this book right here. And I've been talking for nearly an hour. It's hard to believe. My first chapter of my book is entitled Eliphas Levi's Life and Approach to Kabbalah, which is basically what I've been talking about. Chapter 2 is devoted to his influence in France and Great Britain as a prelude to the American scene. And a number of other writers in France and England are dealt with here. And I don't have time to deal with all of them. I will say this, he wrote a great deal about the Knights Templar, the medieval crusading order. And some of his writings about the Templars have been influential in various Masonic groups. In Great Britain, there was an organization that was founded called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, it was not founded until 1888, but they nevertheless claimed Eliphas Levi as a member. And they deal a lot with many different things, including Kabbalah and Tarot. The Tarot appears to have developed out of nowhere. It appeared in Renaissance Italy. There was a French writer named Court de Gebelin who claimed that Tarot was of Egyptian origin. Excavations in Egypt don't prove that at all, quite the contrary. The Egyptians played games, but Tarot was not one of them. And from all indications, there's the Jewish Kabbalah and the Tarot, from wherever it came, are totally independent, two different systems. There's 32 letters um, wait a minute, I'm sorry, 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and there's 22 paths on the Kabbalistic tree of life, and there's 22 cards in the major arcana, the tarot trumps. They're not numbered 1 from 22, but 0 to 21. The only card that's carried over into a regular deck of playing cards today is the Fool, who becomes the Joker. And Levi appears to have been the first person in history to bring a connection between the Tarot and the Kabbalah. The book, The Royal Road, deals with both of these by Bishop Stephen Heller of the Gnostic Church. He points out the independent origins of the two systems, but makes the claim that if the two work together, then use them together. And Carl Jung's position would be both originate the same place in the collective unconscious, and that can be seen as grounds for the similarities. I have a great deal of respect for Eliphas Levi. I have very little respect for another man named Aleister Crowley. He was born the 12th of October 1875, 4.5 months after the death of Eliphas Levi. He was involved in an organization, OTO, Order of the Temple of the Orient, and he was convinced that he had been Eliphas Levi in a previous incarnation. And he did some very bizarre stuff during his lifetime. Called himself the Great Beast, and he died in 1947 at the age of 72, and it's just incredible to me he lived that long because of all his self-destructive behavior involving alcohol and all kinds of drugs that he used. But he managed to make it to 72 somehow. And there's organizations in France and England, a number of them, that reflect Levi's influence. The majority, well, much of his exposure in America of his ideas came through the writings of Albert Pike, the Masonic author, Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite from 1859 to 1891. Pike's book Morals and Dogma, many different sources were used in what would be called plagiarism today, but there's huge chunks taken from both Dogma and Ritual of the High Magic and Transcendental. Another name for that is Transcendental Magic, and then his book The History of Magic. Levi is not by no means the only source that Pike uses, but he is a major source. Through the writings of Rex Hutchins, whom I met at a meeting in Washington, D.C. in 2003, I was able to cross-reference passages from Levi's writings and how they were used by Pike in Morals and Dogma. Pike died on April 2nd, 1891, and he remains a very controversial figure today. Other movements Levi influenced, including Theosophy, was founded by a Russian woman, Madame Helena Blavatsky. It's interesting, she founded the Theosophical Society in New York City in 1875, the same year that Eliphas Levi passed away. And there's no evidence that the two ever met, but some of Levi's European followers became Theosophists in the years after his death. And uh, in her early writings, Madame Blavatsky used the writings of Eliphas Levi before, in her later work, she turned more to Eastern sources. But he definitely had some influence there. Isis Unveiled and Secret Doctrine were two of the major doctrines of major books written by Blavatsky. And anthroposophy can be seen as a spinoff of theosophy. Rudolf Steiner was the founder of that. I found one lecture he gave in which he claimed that Eliphas Levi, in a previous incarnation, had lived in pre-Columbian Mexico. And again, there's various Rosicrucian organizations, that including the one founded by P.B. Randolph, that were influenced by Levi, and again, Randolph visited him in Paris. There's also the Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. There's the Rosicrucian Fellowship, founded by Max Heindel, and the Ancient Mystical Order of Rosicrucians, founded by H. Spencer Lewis. Lewis wrote in Rosicrucian Questions and Answers, Levi was invited to become a part of SRIA in England, and did so with the belief that the founders were really sincere in their desire to delve deeply into Rosicrucian lore and become neophytes of the Rosicrucian organization. I've been a Mason for going on 50 years. I've never been a Rosicrucian. I have read and studied it some. I've driven by their Triangle chapter in Dallas, which is near the campus of SMU. But I know that most Rosicrucians, some of them belong to individual lodges, local lodges, but a lot of them do not. It's mail order mysticism. As long as you send them money, they'll send you lessons to study through the mail. I had some difficulty getting some cooperation when I wrote to them for assistance back in the 90s, because I was not interested in joining. I just wanted to know the influence of this man. And I was able to find out through the one book that Lewis was aware of Levi, and that he considered him a Rosicrucian. And I mentioned OTO, which Aleister Crowley was not the founder, but he was one who had a great deal of influence, and some of the other leaders of OTO were influenced by Levi. Another interesting organization is the Builders of the Adytum, founded by Dr. Paul Foster Case. And Dr. Case used Levi quite a bit, and anyway, he wrote quite a bit about the astral light, which was one of Levi's major ideas. And Case quoted from a 16th century Hebrew manuscript used by Levi in the Dogma and Ritual of High Magic, enumerated the powers and privileges of the man who holds in the right hand the clavicles of Solomon, in his left hand the branch of a blossoming almond. And And there's a number of other groups that pick up on Levi, and um, he has direct influence in some circles, indirect influence in other circles. In my book, I have a whole chapter devoted to Albert Pike, a chapter devoted to religious movements, and chapter 5 is um, Eliphas Levi within the zeitgeist of the 19th century, its relevance to the 20th and 21st centuries. Eliphas Levi and the Kabbalah, the Masonic and French connection of the American mystery tradition, was published in 2006 by my friend Michael Pohl with Cornerstone Books in New Orleans. It can be ordered at Amazon.com and other sources. But it was 175 years ago today. Eliphas Levi moved up to a different level. His influence was profound, and I hope some of you will try to study and learn more about him. Have a good evening.